This playlist collects together and organizes the individual component modules, which together comprise the lecture covering Hilary Kornblith's article, Beyond Foundationalism and Coherence Theory. We'll begin the lecture with a brief biographical sketch of Kornblith, after which we'll begin our discussion of the paper by reviewing some of the components Kornblith introduces in order to set the stage for the discussion that follows. We'll start with the distinction between the context of discovery and the context of justification, explaining how Kornblith portrays these as antagonistic approaches to understanding the nature of justification and knowledge. In order to defend the status of what he calls the causal theory of knowledge against charges that it wrongfully ignores the significance of justification in theorizing about the nature of knowledge, Kornblith claims that the definitional theory of knowledge, the theory that asserts knowledge is justified true belief, has the status of a truism, the implication being that all theorists, regardless of their intent, include a theory of justification within their theory of knowledge. Finally, Kornblith introduces the arguments on papers thesis, or AOP, an apsychological framework for theorizing about the nature of justification common to both the coherentist and the foundationalist. The arguments on papers thesis will serve as a stalking horse for Kornblith throughout the rest of the paper. With these elements in place, Kornblith turns his attention to more substantive arguments and hypotheses. He begins with a thought experiment involving Alford, drawing the conclusion that Alford shows how the arguments on papers thesis fails to capture sufficient conditions for justification, and that in fact reveals the inadequacy of a static and apsychologic approach to justification. Kornblith seeks to extend these insights by reinterpreting the foundationalist regress argument as one which introduces constraints on how to understand belief dependency and temporal priority within a reliabilist process framework. Having extracted what he views as the positive insight of the foundationalist, Kornblith turns his attention to the coherentist and contemplates the cases of Mo and Joe. Kornblith argues that Mo and Joe illustrate that coherence theory correctly identifies the importance of background beliefs in specifying the alternatives against which a process can be evaluated as reliable. Having extracted the positive insights of both foundationalism and coherentism, having expelled its apsychological framework of the arguments on papers thesis, Kornblith ends the paper by performing a grand synthesis, formulating a reliabilist theory of justification, having all of the strengths of coherence theory and foundation theory without any of its liabilities, or so he claims. Let's shift our attention then to the first part of the lecture. In this part of the lecture, after introducing Kornblith with a brief biography, we begin discussing the distinction that he draws between the context of discovery and the context of justification. We'll see he views these two contexts as both antagonistic and antithetical. He associates process theories of justification with the context of discovery and relational theories with the context of justification. At this time, he identifies himself as a causal theorist, though we would probably refer to him as a reliabilist. Because he identifies himself as a causal theorist, and because Goldman's 1967 causal theory of knowledge, as we'll recall, had no explicit justificational component, he feels he has to defend causal theories against the charge that they ignore, downplay, or otherwise neglect the role of justification in epistemology. His strategy for doing this is to point to the definitional theory of knowledge, that knowledge is justified true belief. He says that this is a truism, and he thinks that the implication of that is that any theory of knowledge offered up by any theorist, regardless of their intent in formulating that theory of knowledge, de facto contains, either implicitly or explicitly, a definition of justification. He explains this using what he calls two routes or paths to defining justification. The direct route, in which one directly defines justification as a clause or as a separate standalone theory. The indirect route, where one defines knowledge, and in doing so, once we pull out the truth and we pull out the belief, we have the residual part of the theory that is actually a theory of justification. We'll end this section of the lecture by introducing this notion of the arguments on papers thesis. Kornblith introduces this arguments on papers thesis, or AOPT, as his stalking horse, which he'll be attacking for the rest of the paper. The arguments on paper's thesis, as he understands it, is an anti-psychological or apsychological framework adopted by both foundationalists and coherence theorists to formulate and debate theories of justification. He wants to reject the arguments on paper's thesis, but he doesn't want to reject all of the insights of foundationalism or coherentism. He'll argue against the arguments on paper thesis, and then he'll go through and talk about what insights to say from foundationalism and what insights he wants to say from coherentism. So this is Hilary Kornblith. He received his PhD from Cornell in 1980. He was a student of two very famous philosophers, Richard Boyd, who was a famous philosopher of science, and Sidney Shoemaker, who was a famous metaphysician and epistemologist. He spent his early career at the University of Vermont. He was chair of that department for many years, and in 2003 he moved to the University of Massachusetts at Amherst, where he continues to teach as a full professor today. He's published 4 books. The first 2 books are Inductive Inference and Its Natural Ground and Knowledge and Its Place in Nature. His most recent book is Second Thoughts and the Epistemological Enterprise. He also edited 2 important anthologies, Naturalizing Epistemology, the second edition of which was published in 1995, and Epistemology, Internalism and Externalism, which was originally published in 2001. Kornblith begins his paper by suggesting that contemporary epistemology has inherited an unfortunate tendency to divorce epistemological questions from psychological questions. And in fact, part of the purpose of this paper is to argue that foundationalism and coherence theory share a common anti-psychological presupposition, that they inherited this presupposition from logical positivism, that this presupposition is in fact false and should be rejected, and that once it's rejected, we're free to combine the insights of foundationalism and coherence theory into a unified account of justification, which is the ultimate aim of his paper. He doesn't elaborate in great detail as to what exactly he's referring to, but in all likelihood he's referring to the distinction between the context of discovery and the context of justification, a distinction whose introduction is commonly attributed to Hans Reichenbach, a German philosopher from the Berlin Circle of logical empiricism. Reichenbach didn't actually invent the distinction between the context of discovery and the context of justification, though he did use it to try and defend Einstein and Einstein's theories from the Nazis. And it was an important distinction for the development of logical empiricism, both in the Vienna and the Berlin circles. The motivation for distinguishing between a context of discovery and a context of justification had everything to do with the respective roles that the logical empiricists assigned to the scientists on one hand and themselves on the other. The context of discovery was the domain of science. It was the everyday working of scientists as they experimented, gathered data, formulated models, and bickered amongst themselves. It was a sloppy, poorly disciplined, and unrigorous day-to-day enterprise. The context of justification, on the other hand, was what was assigned to the logical empiricists. The logical empiricists would step in once the scientists had done their work, and they would in effect perform conceptual house cleaning. Carnap once described it as a rational reconstruction. What the empiricists intended to do then was to formulate the discoveries of the scientists in a way that made all the connections explicit, tied them explicitly to the data, and rendered them rigorous and epistemically unassailable. So this distinction between the context of discovery and the context of justification comes to be one between the process of doing science and the process of justifying science. And this is the distinction that Kornblith objects to, a radical bifurcation between the lived dynamic process of discovery and the sterile, static reconstruction of the epistemic links between data and theory.